Good afternoon. I want to say South Africa. It's a great privilege to chat to you today, and we are literally talking about this draft health regulations. What is going on? And I'm very privileged to be joined today by two amazing men that are fighting at the forefront for our freedoms. And so we're going to try to make this quick, short to the point, and help everybody understand what's going on. If you are listening, wherever you're listening from, and you're also a little bit worried, confused, fearful, you've been receiving a lot of stuff about what's happening with the draft regulations. Are my submissions being heard? Have they been deleted? Do I have to submit again? Whatever questions you might have about this, please share this immediately with your friends as we are live right now. Make sure you share it to everybody. And let them get on this, whether you're on YouTube right now or Facebook. Just share it with your friends and tell them, hey, get on, we're going to chat about this. And if you have any questions, please post them in the comments. I will see them, and I can then also try to answer them or have one of my guests answer the questions for you. These are very important matters, very serious matters, and we want to make sure that we understand exactly what's going on so that we can act accordingly. So without further ado, I'm going to pull in my friend here, Michael Swain from ForSA. Welcome, Michael.
Great to see you, Heinz. Thanks for having me again.
Of course, things have heated up quite a bit since we spoke last, and there has been a lot happening. So I thought we need to do a follow-up, and we need to just bring some clarity to what's going on. The last time I spoke to you, it was all about make your submission against the draft health regulations, and we talked about how to do that. But then there's been some stuff happening that's caused some confusion. I want to ask you to, as briefly and as accurately, help us understand what is going on, so that we can and tell us what do we need to do right now, and then we can also chat to Stephen and bring it all together at the end. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Heinz, and I'll do my best. I think a lot of your viewers and listeners will be aware that there have been messages that have been circulating on social media ever since the Minister of Health appeared before the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee for Health on Thursday, the 14th of April. That was Thursday last week. And I think the good news is that his appearance was in all likelihood, and probably Steve can comment further, was precipitated by the extraordinary scale of comments and criticisms that have already been received by and submitted to the department. To date, just on the DRSA platform alone, which is the platform which is linked from the forsa.org.za site, over 270,000 individual submissions have been sent through to the minister since these draft health regulations were first gazetted on the 15th of March, and the public were given, as you may recall, 30 days for comment. Now, those 30 days were supposed to end on Good Friday. That was Friday the 15th of April. But at his presentation, or as part of his presentation to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, the minister decided to give an additional 10 days for comment. So in other words, we can now respond, we can now continue to comment up until Sunday, the 24th of April. That's this coming Sunday. So there are more days, which is, I think, a good news. I think the thing to remember, of course, is that we are, in any event, looking to object to these regulations because of what they will mean if they are passed in their current form. Now, let's just remember, perhaps in a little recap, maybe people haven't even become aware of that, that, of course, some of the problems with these draft health regulations is that they contain numerous unconstitutional provisions that will give basically the Minister of Health the same and maybe even wider and more sweeping powers to rule the nation in the same unaccountable way by basically executive regulation that we've experienced during the COVID-19 state of national disaster, which has now ended, apart from these transitional regulations, which we'll get back to.
Okay, so there's been an extension, and we have more time, but the confusion, I think, has come in with people sharing this video from a lawyer, if I understand correctly, from I forget the name now of that organization, Freedom for something. Can you help me there? What's that?
Yeah, it's called Action for Freedom.
Action for
So
freedom.
yes, let's just let's just clarify that, because this has been a source of some confusion.
Yeah.
You see, basically what he was highlighting was the fact that when these regulations were first gazetted on March the 15th, they were gazetted. There were almost certainly some errors, some typos in the first set of regulations that were gazetted. And so they actually then issued a second set of regulations on the same day, March the 15th, which replaced the first set. But basically, they are substantively the same.
Okay.
So in all likelihood, even though there are some typos and some errors, they were probably exactly that. They were typographical errors. And given that, of course, both sets of regulations under the notice issued on March the 15th are substantially the same, even though the minister subsequently made an error when he pointed with the extension timing to the gazetted regulations that had actually been cancelled. That I think was just an error on his behalf. Another error, should I say. I mean, this whole process has been deeply flawed by errors from the department. And that's actually a very good thing when you take something under review. But it does not mean that the submissions which you have already made are invalid. They are still valid. Do not
Okay.
regret doing it. And if you haven't done it already, please, you have this extension of time. Go to the
Yeah.
forsa.org.za website and make your submission, because obviously the department cannot possibly claim or try to claim that because they had made an error in pointing to a set of regulations that they'd already cancelled, somehow that makes all the submissions invalid. I mean, that's never going to fly, certainly
Okay.
not in a court of law. So
All right.
please don't be confused, don't be concerned. Just keep pressing in, keep pushing on. If you haven't made your submissions, as I say, now's the time. Make your submission now.
So, what do you say about the accusation that there's something sinister going on, a sinister plot to confuse people so that submissions can't be taken in? How should people react to the fact that it seems some emails have been deleted without even being seen? And now there's this, it seems to, some people are saying this is like a sleight of hand move, but it seems more likely that it's just errors and I don't know, interesting mistakes being made. What do you think?
Well, it literally could be, departmental incompetence on behalf of their staff. Look, there is no doubt, and we have had multiple reports that emails have been deleted without being opened, without being read. And we, in
All
fact,
right.
wrote to the Minister of Health even before the beginning of last week, and we challenged this matter. We gave him evidence that we had, and we've asked for an explanation. We haven't yet received one, but be that as it may, the fact of the matter is that this is also, by the way, something which we gave into the Action for Freedom case, because we provided them with this evidence, which would also strengthen their case. And it will certainly come up later as and when these regulations may be passed, unless government have really listened to the voice of the people. If they carry on the same, then this is just yet another, we believe, gross violation of the principle of administrative justice, in as much as the government cannot ask for requests, make requests for submissions and open it to the public for comment, and then simply just delete and not even read the ones that they receive. That's just not possible. And it
Okay.
will certainly open the whole process up to a legal challenge, assuming that these regulations do go through and government tries to push them through.
Okay. Michael, I'm going to quickly pop over to Stephen and welcome him, and then I'm going to ask him a question and then bring all three of you back. So just hang on there for a sec for me. Hello, Stephen Swart, all the way from Gansbaai.
Hi,
Welcome.
good evening, Heinz, and thank you so much for hosting us, and well done also to Michael and ForSA. Incredible work that's been done together with the ACDP at Parliament, fighting the good fight, fighting for our freedoms.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. Stephen, with all of this happening and these things going on, from your experience in Parliament, with government, legislation, all these kinds of things, with people worrying about this being some sinister plot to deceive people, do you think that's plausible, or is it more plausible that there's just bad communication, people not doing their jobs very well? What is the more plausible situation?
Well, it's always difficult to gauge when you're dealing with a socialist-oriented government. But looking at the regulations here, it seems that these are just errors, typographical errors that have been committed
Okay.
time and time again. And I will just join Michael in saying I would urge the members of the public to make their submissions, to voice their objections on the various platforms. Dear South Africa, the ACDP has got a platform, ForSA, everyone to voice your objections, because public participation is a constitutional right. It is enshrined as in terms of the National Assembly what is required. Yes, the government doesn't have to listen to what you say or follow what you say, but they have to consider every public submission, must be considered. So that's why it's a great concern to us with the allegations of deletions of emails, although the minister has denied that. And I think that also was part of the reason why further extension was granted. Last week, we in the ACDP were part of that meeting, and we also requested for this extension. But we never, of course, when you ask when an extension is granted and they granted it on the wrong government gazette. But again, as Michael correctly pointed out, all these errors do lend itself to a review should government continue with these very overarching regulations, which in our view are absolutely unacceptable and are just a continuation of the lockdown provisions that we had. And what is probably significant, myself as a member of parliament for 23 odd years, we have played no role as members of parliament, both in the disaster management regulations and now these regulations, in drafting them. We've got no power. These are, and maybe one has to amend the Act to ensure that regulations must at least be tabled before Parliament. But here it's purely published for comment and then is kicked into law, and that is totally unacceptable. So I urge people to make submissions. But of course, we've also engaged on public protests, on public marches. We had a march on the 13th to the Constitutional Court, ACDP, and a number of church groupings. It was very well attended. We had a picket on the 14th of March outside Parliament. And of course, we're planning a significant march next week on the 27th of March, as 27th of April, to voice our objections. And I'm really excited. I'm encouraged to see the sleeping giant, the church, is awakening. People are taking a stand and will not accept this discrimination that is set out in these regulations, such as not allowing unvaccinated people into your churches. That's totally unacceptable, and we reject that, as do many church leaders.
Yeah. And it's a good day. It's Freedom Day. So let's stand for real freedom. I'm going to bring Michael back into the conversation. Welcome back, Michael. So now that I have all of us here together, so there's the current situation that we need to deal with. And if I can summarize for those who maybe are listening and going, I don't even know what happened before this, so I really don't know what's going on. A quick summary is that we have a Health Act that have certain regulations that give the health minister a lot of powers. They are currently amending or trying to amend these regulations to give the minister even more power, but which have an overreach of power without any parliamentary oversight, any accountability from any other department. So if these regulations were to go through, for example, they can decide what is a notifiable medical condition, which they can declare that with from their own opinion even, this is a notifiable medical condition. Then they can put on you certain things you have to do in terms of hospitalization, isolation, all kinds of things that they can force you to do. And it goes on and on and on, and it gets much worse. And we are trying to stop these regulations. But if I can take a step back, what will it take to actually change the Health Act as it is right now so that these regulations cannot be used in this way? If I can ask Michael first, maybe.
Well, the only way that you can amend an Act of Parliament is by bringing to the table an amendment bill. In other words, it would be like the National Health Act Amendment Bill. And that would target certain provisions in the existing Health Act and then put amended law, if you like, which would then obviously be the subject of a public participation process, which can be quite time consuming. but which we believe, and I'm sure that Steve will agree, is absolutely necessary. Because the problem is that embedded in both this Health Act and, of course, in the National Disaster Act are these provisions which Parliament has already passed. So these things are already actually law.
Yeah.
Whereby the minister, which is really an individual, a single individual, perhaps advised by cabinet or who knows who, can literally regulate and dictate any and every aspect of our lives. We just have to remember back to lockdown when we were told what time we had to be back in our houses, what food we could or could not buy, whether we could buy alcohol, whether we could go to the beach. I mean, this is micromanaging. This is a complete elimination of our rights.
Of our freedom.
And of our freedoms, yes. And that is what we believe needs to be done. There needs to be parliamentary oversight. And I also believe that there needs to be a greater level of public participation, because these regulations literally impact the minutiae. It literally allows government to micromanage every detail of your life. And that cannot be the case in a democratic nation with a constitution, that one minister can have that level of power without any input. Not acceptable.
Steve, what is your take on what needs to happen to change a act like this? I mean, the fact that it was passed in the first place is obviously concerning, but what do we stand to do? Because that seems to be the better or the stronger move, but what will that take?
Well, firstly, one must remember you're dealing with regulations that are in terms of Section 90 of the Act, the National Health Act. That Act was passed in 2003. I don't think it was ever intended to allow for these type of regulations that are so far-reaching.
Okay.
What is interesting is the parallel between these regulations and the Disaster Management Act regulations, where we as parliamentarians also expressed our concerns that we as Parliament, that are the lawmakers, have no say in that act as well, the Disaster Management Act. So there were two private members' bills that were brought to amend that act to allow Parliament a far greater insight or say over the regulations, both the contents and the extension of the lockdowns that was done every single month without Parliament having any say. There were public hearings held. It was going very well in the Culture Committee, and suddenly the ANC chairman, was fired because she was too sympathetic to it, and those private members' bills were rejected. So one can probably see a similar vein here. Should you want to amend the National Health Act to even allow parliamentarians a say over these very contentious regulations as the lawmakers, because you're dealing with a socialist government that likes control. You're dealing with an executive that wants to use this power for whatever purposes. And we've seen a targeting of the churches that's ranging from baton charges, arrests, helicopters, and it's totally unacceptable where you now have this discrimination of certain gatherings allowed, 50% if you're all vaccinated, but if you're not vaccinated, 2,000 outdoors, 1,000 indoors. And totally unacceptable that you're expecting church leaders then to say to people, you cannot come and worship us, we can't pray for your healing because you are unvaccinated. And this is, as church leaders have said, it is mandatory vaccinations through the back door. And the other provisions that allow grab and jab are also deeply concerning. So even, as I've said before, even if you are the most forceful supporter of vaccinations, you should be not supportive of mandatory vaccines that are now, as we saw, lockdowns of churches being closed, now to prevent you as a worshipper going to churches. It's totally unacceptable. So we've got to take a strong stance, but an amendment to the Act it will take years. We have to fight these regulations now by public submissions, and if it's not to it, we've got to march in the streets, and thirdly, we will go to court. The ACDP is committed to take these regulations on review to court to contest it. We believe it is totally immoral and unconstitutional.
Wow. Well done, Stephen, and thank you for doing that. And Michael, thank you for doing what you guys are doing. Can I ask both of you just a final push for people to do what they can do right now, and to just remind us that our submissions do count, they do matter, especially if we go through these platforms, because there's another record that's being kept. Am I right?
Yes, no, you're 100% correct. That every
Okay.
submission that is made through the DSA platform is recorded and kept and will ultimately be delivered a second time, if you like, to the department. So there's no way that they can deny it. I think what
Okay.
we've got to also understand is that what's happening here is that you may recall at the end of the national state of disaster, as the minister basically said, the state of disaster ends, she then passed regulations which effectively kept the whole show going for 30 days. So it's a
Yeah.
maximum of 30 days until May the 4th. And I think what they were obviously hoping and planning to do was to quickly push these regulations through under the National Health Act so that they could just flip flop on the 4th and it would just carry on as usual. Now, the big thorn in the side, I think, are submissions. Because as Steve rightly pointed out, when government opens up something for comment and public participation, and the public respond, and 270,000 plus have responded, government must read every single one of those submissions, take a note of them, and listen to what they say. They can't just simply steamroller through. And so if you think about it now, they've got until the 24th now to make submissions. So make those submissions. Let's crank up the numbers because it makes it almost impossible for government to show that from the 24th until the 4th, they have now read all these submissions, taken them all into account, and made the necessary adjustments or not, depending upon what they choose. And
Yeah.
it just makes it so hard for them to simply seamlessly hand over from one executive control to the other. And this could be, I think, the best way that we can put a stop to the way that we've been ruled. This is undemocratic. It is unconstitutional. It should never be the case in this country that we are ruled
Absolutely.
by an unaccountable executive. So that is why it's so important. forsa.org.za. Make your submission. It literally takes you 3 minutes to do it, but it will make a difference and your voice counts.
Amen. So good. Stephen, is it enough for Christians to just pray, or should we take action?
Prayer is important, but action is required.
Amen.
It is so important. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us blameless. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. We must take a stand now. Every public submission will be counted, must be counted. We had it with the land expropriation issues, where there had to be an audit of every single written submission. Every submission will be considered. It is constitutionally required. Public participation is required. Some of the laws have been struck down for a lack of proper public consultation. The Matatiel case, the Doctors for Life case. So this is, I can't emphasize enough in supporting Michael and yourself in saying let's make submissions on the ForSA platform, on the Dear South Africa platform, on the ACDP platform. Let's make our voice heard, and then let's pray, but let's take a stand, join the marches. We will also at our physical marches be having physical documents that we will also be handing in to add to all the public submissions in opposition to these draconian and reckless. Even the scientists are rejecting, their own scientists are rejecting these regulations. So whose view are they following? What socialist agenda is being followed? So with that, I just want to thank you, Heinz. I want to thank you, Michael, for this opportunity of expressing and taking a stand at this time. It's incredible to see the sleeping giant, the church, arising at this time.
Amen. And just a final point, I know you've made these before. I just want to make it again to those who are listening. Michael, just maybe a final thought to speak to the fact that these regulations are actually unnecessary because we do have a Disaster Management Act, right?
Yeah, no, that's 100%. I mean, that is one of the big concerns that I think everybody has about these regulations is why do we need them? You know, were there to be some new disease or what have you, like Ebola or some outbreak of some dread disease, then government has the power under the National Disaster Act to declare a state of national disaster. They've just done so, by the way, in KwaZulu-Natal after the floods.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they've got these powers in their hand, so to speak. Why do we need these under the Health Act? It is absolutely unnecessary. And we basically realize that if we don't speak up and do something, once this structure is in place, once government have got these things in place, that means that they can activate them at any time they like, and they can run them indefinitely. So this will literally be the new normal for the way the country is run if we don't stop this. So that's why it is so important that we make our submissions and we make our voices heard.
If I can ask this question to both of you, just as a final thought, what would you say to people who say we are overreacting, that they will never do these things that we say is possible when you look at the open-endedness of the draft regulations? What would you say to people that say this is overreaction? Stephen, you first, and then Michael.
Well, Heinz, we saw the devastating impact of the heavy-handed approach with the lockdowns, where we saw tens of thousands of businesses closing, more than 2 million people losing their jobs, the devastation that was caused. Yes, we all thought it was necessary in the first 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And then, as Michael pointed out earlier, where you could walk, what you could eat, what clothes you could wear. And that you must see against the background of a socialist control. We've got to wake up at this time and see that it's now been shifted across with this idea of controlling. And who are we following? Who are our friends? Well, it's Russia, it's China. One of the regulations says you must have compliance officers in all your organizations, straight out of the KGB, the Stasi, that you now spy on one another. And so we cannot allow this. So it's not an issue. I've been there in Parliament for 23 years, and one can see an agenda of more and more control.
Okay.
And we've got a constitution that protects our constitutional rights of freedom of religion, freedom of association, and that is still paramount. And that's why at the end of the day, that is why it is there. Public participation is there for us to test these regulations against our constitutional rights.
Okay. Michael, why is this not overreacting?
You know, we have a saying that you always have to be aware of the law of unintended consequences. In other words, things that you don't necessarily think of at the time. And could that ever happen? I mean, to be honest with you, look at the situation that this country has faced with state capture. Who would have thought that the constitutional powers of the president could be used in this type of a way? We never thought that when President Mandela was going to be president. And unfortunately, what happens is that once they're in place, and if the wrong people get hold of them, then look out. I mean, listen, under the lockdown, nearly 450,000 people were arrested for breaches of the lockdown regulations. That means that they've literally got criminal records. People who did terrible things like arriving 3 minutes after curfew at 9 p.m. at their houses, or stepping onto the beach to rescue their runaway toddler from drowning in the sea. I mean, you know, it's almost ludicrous to think of some of the things that happened and some of the overreach and some of the abuses that happened. So if you want government to have these powers to activate them any time for any reason and to do anything to your life, then by all means sit and do nothing and just say, well, I'll just live with that when it happens. But let me tell you something. Once it's passed, it can happen. And if it can happen, it probably will.
Wow. Sure. It's scary stuff on the one hand, but on the other hand, the good news is we can do something about it. So I just want to say thank you, Michael. Thank you for you and your team at ForSA for doing what you're doing, for fighting. We really appreciate you guys. And I want to encourage everyone that's watching and listening to please go and support them financially and support them by spreading the news and the word of what they are doing. Steve, thank you so much for joining us as well. Thank you for the amazing work that you are doing. You and the ACDP, good luck with the marches. May it go really well. We will be praying for you and supporting you wherever we can. And thank you so much for what you are doing. Have a great evening and have a great rest of the week with everything that you are doing. And may God be with you as you do that. I'm going to greet you and just do a final greeting to our online guests. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today with this very important conversation. And just as a final word, remember, please make your submission. The link is in this post, or just go to forsa.org.za. Make sure that you make your submission on the Dear SA website. Every submission counts. There is a record of it. The government can delete it if they want to, but there is a record kept. So don't worry about it. Don't be fearful. Just be alert and aware and do what you can and help us to spread the word to everyone that can make these submissions. All right, that's it from us. May God bless you. Have a great evening, and thank you for being with us today. Goodbye.